This video was made possible with the support of our Patreon members. Welcome and thank you so much for tuning into the Psychology Is podcast. I am your host, Nick Fortino, and today I'm talking to Dr. Miriam Grossman. And I think that honestly, I'm a little nervous. I'm going to be fully transparent for multiple reasons. I think the topic that we are discussing, which is essentially gender and, the content of your book entitled Lost in Transnation, a child psychiatrist's guide out of the madness. And generally speaking, we want to talk about gender ideology, transgenderism, the medical interventions that are being utilized and often kind of imposed upon people. The topics is just very charged. And given my personality, being very agreeable, wanting to be liked, not wanting to offend people, it's a difficult one for me to talk about publicly. And this is really the first episode where we have addressed this. But I think it's very important. And I think that the things that you are saying are extremely timely and important. And something that you really emphasize in the book is this false consensus perception, the Castro consensus, this idea that this is settled, that this conversation is over and we need not talk about it anymore. And anyone who does try to question established beliefs must be hateful in some way. But that is not the case. So, and I think another reason I'm a little nervous is because I almost feel like there's no winning here. And it forces me to really question, what's my goal with this conversation? Because there's a large camp of people, of course, many of whom are conservative, who are going to listen to everything we say, and their response is going to just be like, duh. And then there's a large camp of people, most of whom are progressive or liberal, who are not going to be open to anything that we're talking about. But perhaps there is some percentage of people who are thinking through this issue, who find it to be interesting psychologically, and who will find value in this. So those are all my kind of admissions up front. Please.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me, Nick. And I would like to respond to what you just said. First of all, the fact that you are nervous about this and that you're doing it anyway, that is called courage. Mm-hmm. So people might think that courage means that you're not nervous or afraid of saying and doing stuff. But no, what it means is that you do it anyway, in spite of feeling ambivalent and worried about what the consequences might be. And like you said, you're a person that I think you said, likes to keep the peace and, not to, I can't remember what words you said, but, you don't want to ruffle feathers and make people upset. Believe it or not, I'm actually also like that. But a point came in my career when I realized there's just too much going on that's wrong, and there are too many people being hurt, both young people and their families, and that it's wrong to keep silent. And I was very, very nervous. I wrote a book years ago called Unprotected. And it wasn't specifically about gender at all, but it was about the profession of mental health and the medical profession being hijacked by politics. And I was so worried when I wrote that book about what the consequences to me would be that it came out anonymously. Right. I didn't even put my name on the cover at first. Sure. Eventually, yes, I certainly did put my name on the cover, and I'm very proud of that book. But your audience should know that there are times, and I think we're living, not I think, we're living in such a time that there are many wrongs that are going on. And the truth is being hidden, and the truth is not available to many, many people. And it's our responsibility as adults, as responsible adults, and certainly as medical providers and mental health providers, to make the truth available, to talk the truth.
Well, thank you for that response. I feel empowered by the idea that I'm being courageous right now. And you're right. You're right. That is the right definition of courage. And I do feel that I'm being courageous in this moment. Well, let me give you a more formal introduction here so people really know your background, who you are. So Dr. Grossman is a board-certified psychiatrist in the subspecialty of child and adolescent psychiatry. You are the author of 4 books, including what you just mentioned, Unprotected, and You're Teaching My Child What, as well as the one we mentioned, Lost in Translation. Your work exposes the origin and hazards of the sexuality and gender industry and has been translated into 11 languages. You've lectured at the British House of Lords and the United Nations, and are featured in the Daily Wire's What is a Woman documentary. So I'd like to maybe just say a few words up front, do most of my talking in the beginning here, and then be primarily, the question asker from then on. And because I was feeling nervous, I even decided to write some of my thoughts down and make sure that I articulate myself accurately. So I'll start by saying that I think there are many, trans-identifying individuals who consider me to be an ally. And I am an ally to their well-being, their trust is not misplaced. And I am essentially conducting this interview with the imagined presence of those individuals kind of looking over my shoulder. And I want to just make sure that I don't come across as two-faced to anybody, but at the same time, I don't hold back in expressing what I really think. And so here's some of what I really think. I would like to begin by saying what may be obvious, but maybe needs to be said, that whoever you are, however you identify or present yourself, you, of course, deserve to be loved, respected, and protected from harm. I think there is this widespread perception that the only people questioning these modern frameworks about gender are the same people who oppose homosexuality and who tend to be, frankly, judgmental religious people who oppose any form of non-traditional self-expression. And you kind of debunk that throughout your book, by the way. You point out in many cases, by referring to many different surveys, that that's not the case. But anyway, while it is probably true that everyone who is opposed to, for example, gay marriage or non-traditional forms of self-expression, surely they all do oppose modern gender ideologies. But there is, I think, a large and growing number of people who are kind and not just tolerant, but accepting and celebratory of homosexuality and non-traditional forms of self-expression. And I'm one of them. And everything I express in this conversation comes from a place of kindness and from a commitment to a philosophy of life that is sound, that is based in reality, and that is ultimately conducive to human flourishing. And so, in my opinion, the dominant cultural narratives and the messaging to gender-distressed individuals or non-stereotypical boys and girls are all wrong. The message has become, if you don't feel like a typical girl, maybe you're not a girl. But the message should be, If you don't feel like a typical girl, you get to be whatever type of girl you want to be. You get to help us expand the possibilities for what it means to be a girl, for what a girl can act like and present like. If you disavow your identity of being a girl, it's like Team Girl has lost one of its most interesting players. That there is a mass of people who now identify as non-binary or transgender has really resulted in less diversity within the demographics of boys and of girls. And at this rate, anyone who even slightly deviates from the most caricaturized versions of male and female will stop considering themselves one or the other and will be left with extremely homogeneous populations of men and women. And so the message, in my opinion, to young people should be whatever kind of girl you wish to be. Be whatever kind of boy you wish to be. You are free to express yourself, but it's very important that you embrace your nature. And lastly, I just want to let the record show that this is my position, that I am against the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgical procedures, especially performed on minors, in the name of gender affirmation or gender reassignment. I'm against any law that gets in between parents and their children. And adults, of course, are more capable of fully grasping the consequences of such interventions, and obviously they're autonomous. So my emotions are not as passionate around that, but it should be acknowledged that adults are also vulnerable to being misled by unsubstantiated claims. Like you said, for adults too, the truth is unavailable sometimes. Adults are vulnerable to groupthink and to indoctrination, and they may encounter medical professionals who present a far narrower set of solutions to their distress than actually exist. So I see a massive problem here. And when it comes to these interventions being used on minors, I feel quite passionately that this is a crime against humanity. So those are my upfront statements. Thank you for listening, Dr. Grossman.
Very, very well said.
You know, it's really interesting on the note of kind of the messaging needs to be, you can be whatever kind of boy or girl you want to be. I honestly feel like so many of the things that, like, if let's say, for example, if you know, one of the many cases you cover in this book, if a teenage girl said to their parents, not, I think I might be a boy and I want you to call me by Oscar, but I think I might be a masculine girl, that hits way differently. I think parents would be quick to be like, okay, like, what kind of clothes you want to wear then? Like, easy to embrace that. So it's almost like so much of this confusion is based on you, like, thinking of masculine and feminine as the same as male and female. So anyway, let's hear from you now.
Well, you brought up so many good points. Let's see. I mean, let's just begin by underscoring, the premise of my book is that we are all, each one of us, a mosaic of male and female. And whatever that mosaic is beautiful, and we need to celebrate it and leave the body alone. So, I'm agreeing with you that if only we could see this as a reflection of the fact that there's no one way to be a girl and no one way to be a boy. But as you well know, our professional associations are not looking at it that way. And they are advising providers, parents, teachers, all adults really, to affirm whatever identity even the youngest child may come up with. So, my professional organization, I don't belong to it, but if I did belong to an organization, it would probably be the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And they, just like the American Psychiatric Association and so many other groups, advise professionals and parents to immediately rubber stamp whatever identity your child comes up with and to go along with their requests for a new name and new pronouns, without challenging, without saying, just a minute, let's look at this, let's see what this is about. Where did you hear about this possibility? Where are you learning about it? Do you know somebody? Because you see, in the past 10 or 15 years, there's been a radical shift in the numbers and the types of individuals who are expressing themselves or wanting to be considered the opposite sex or some other variant. At one time, not long ago, like I say in my book, when I was training to be a doctor and a psychiatrist, I never came across even one case of an individual with what we would now call gender dysphoria, which is a persistent and intense dislike of your sexed body, discomfort with your sexed body, and an intense wish to be the other sex, or an insistence that one actually is the other sex. Just for convenience, I'm saying the other sex, and the people listening know that there's now the non-binary and other categories that have been added to that list. But just for convenience sake, I'm going to say the opposite sex. Mm-hmm. So I went to medical school and did my training in psychiatry in New York City, and basically a suburb of New York City. And so, I was in a medical environment in which we saw the most unusual medical and psychiatric disorders. And even so, these cases were so rare that I did not see even one person. And I never expected in my entire career to see anybody with this diagnosis. It was then called gender identity disorder, because it only occurred in tens of thousands or even hundreds, let's say 100,000 cases. It's just extremely, extremely rare. And most of these cases fell into two categories. They were either middle-aged men who for many years cross-dressed and enjoyed wearing women's clothing, and then at a point in their lives, they decided that they wanted to present as a woman. That was one type of gender identity disorder, as it was called then. And the other, also extremely rare, were in children who from an early age, even preschool age, would insist that they are the opposite sex. Almost all of these kids were boys, and Jazz Jennings was the poster child of such a case of a so-called transgender little boy who, from the time he was in diapers, apparently, from the time he was not even in kindergarten, was insisting that he was a girl. He asked his parents, if he could wake up the next day without a penis. And there were other examples, but these were the primary cases that were seen, that were discussed in the psychiatric literature, the little boys who wish to be girls, and the middle-aged men, with mostly heterosexual men, actually. Some of them were gay, who wanted to live their lives as a woman. And again, extremely rare. And I should add, Nick, that the studies that were done on the younger cohort, the young boys, showed that a vast majority of them, once they went through normal puberty and entered young adulthood, their feelings of unhappiness with their sex resolved. Many of them were gay and lesbian, but they no longer wished to have a different body. So we know from those studies, there's 11 studies that showed us that the numbers were anywhere between something like 65 and 98% of these kids who either, without any intervention or with psychological support and help for the family, the child eventually desisted. That is the word that was used and is still used, desisted, for an individual that has discomfort with their sex, and with time it resolves. So, what's happened? What's happened is that in the past 10 years or so, there's been a very dramatic development. And the vast majority of kids, almost all the kids that we're seeing now, and that I've seen in my practice, are the kids who have no history of ever having been unhappy with being a boy or a girl. But in adolescence, they are exposed to these ideas and this possibility, and they are exposed to the notion that if they are unhappy, if they are anxious, depressed, they don't fit into a certain group at school, they feel themselves to be outsiders, they feel themselves to be very different, they don't like themselves, wherever it might be, that the solution to their emotional distress is that they actually are in the wrong body. And that if they begin to live as the opposite sex, they will emotionally feel much better, and that this is the solution for them. So where do they hear these ideas? Well, almost everywhere, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to tell you that the culture that we're living in right now celebrates this idea that people might be in the wrong bodies, and that this is not any sort of a disorder or any kind of an emotional condition. It's just a variant of human development. And gender affirming care, so-called gender affirming care, which is the model of care in this country and in Canada that prevails. Gender affirming care calls for adults to rubber stamp a child's new identity without deeply diving into their history, without a comprehensive psychiatric exam that would take time and look at the child's inner life. Who is this child? What is their life about? What's going on in the family? What's going on at school with friends? Has the child been through any particular trauma? Has this girl or boy been sexually abused, molested? let's look at their lives, which is what we do in a standard psychiatric exam and evaluation.
Right.
But you see, gender affirming care calls for the acceptance of this new identity and the social and medical transitioning of a young person without taking a deep dive into what's really behind it.
Mm.
And that's the danger.
Mm. Thank you for laying that out. And I know in your book you use the terms early onset gender dysphoria and adult onset gender dysphoria, which were the first two phenomena you were describing. But what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, as you call it, is rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Oh, and I didn't correct. No, I'm sorry, Nick. So what I mentioned is that in the past 10 years or so, we have this new group. And it's not only that this new group are teenagers without a history of gender dysphoria, it's that a majority are girls.
Right.
And a majority have pre-existing mental health issues.
Right. You mentioned autism, PTSD, anxiety, depression, OCD are correlated with this.
Yes.
It's really interesting to me. You pointed out that it was Dr. Lisa Littman who coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I took it upon myself to just Google the term, right? And I like to do this with all kinds of things. Just what would a lay person find if they Googled something? And what they would find is that this term is offensive and it is, it's not to be taken seriously. And while it's true that it's not an official diagnosis, as you acknowledge in your book, it's not in the DSM or anything, it's a useful term. It does delineate a different phenomenon. And it's very important to delineate that because that phenomenon is very different than the first two that you described. And essentially we have a social contagion phenomenon occurring with rapid onset gender dysphoria. Now, maybe before we explore that further, if it comes up again, I do want to talk about the sex gender distinction. Right? This is one of the key tenets of this ideology. And there's a particular quote that you quoted in your book, which was articulated by Dr. Marcy Bowers, who is the president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And so maybe this can kind of kick off this segment of the conversation about the sex gender distinction. And then I want to highlight some serious contradictions within that philosophy. So Dr. Bowers said, assigning gender identity on the basis of genitalia makes about as much sense as assigning it on the basis of height. Biologically, we're much closer to each other because everyone starts out with primordial female anatomy. So everything a male has, a female has, and vice versa. It's just a matter of how the cards are shuffled, she said.
Yeah.
And you address that and refute that in your book. But just off the top of your head in this moment, how do you respond to a statement like that?
Okay. Great question. I'm going to respond in 1 second. I just want to go back and say something so important about ROGD, the rapid onset gender dysphoria. So the reason why that term and that idea has been so rejected with, robustly, aggressively rejected by the proponents of gender ideology is because it challenges the very foundation of their movement,
right,
which is that a feeling male or female is something that is intrinsic to every person, and that it is not related to biology, and that we have to accept every person's experience, and that that it's permanent. So if someone declares themselves to be the opposite sex, that is that shouldn't be challenged. It's their reality. They get to construct their own reality, and it's wrong, and it's harmful for people to challenge that. And what ROGD does, what Lisa Lippman did in her famous paper that came out in 2018 that was smeared and it was boycotted and so on and so forth, she demonstrated that very, very often, and in the cases that we were all seeing starting a bunch of years ago, these kids' identities were not something that was intrinsic and unchangeable. The opposite, actually. These identities were related to what they had heard online, what they had learned on YouTube, having a friend or a classmate who was living, presenting as the opposite sex, and that it followed the pattern of a well-known phenomenon in psychology called social contagion, which you mentioned. And so, this is the last thing that gender ideologues, people who, profoundly believe in the idea of gender being something that's innate and fixed and permanent, this is the opposite of that.
Right.
If it's a social contagion, then it's not innate and it's not permanent. Right. So that is the problem with that so many people have with ROGD. Okay, now let's go to Marcy Bowers and Dr. Bowers arguing that we might as well categorize people on the basis of height instead of male and female. Instead of, I guess, genitalia is what she said, genitalia. So, my understanding of male and female has actually evolved, and I've learned more even in the past year since my book came out. And the way that I define, first of all, gender and sex are not synonyms. One of the big issues that we have right now is that they are being used as synonyms, especially by the medical profession, the mental health profession. And this is very disturbing to me because gender and sex are not the same. Sex relates to one's physical reality. And it's a biological category that describes whether a person's reproductive system is designed to produce eggs or sperm. There's only two possibilities because humans, like all mammals, reproduce with one of two cells, sperm or eggs. And our reproductive systems are designed around the possibility of producing one or the other. And the reason why I say the possibility is because there are people who fall into the category of they have sex developmental disorders of sexual development, or intersex, and now this has become a big topic because after the Olympics, obviously it's a big topic because of the two boxers who apparently have XY chromosomes, but they live as women, so they were boxing as women and they got gold medals. So that's the reason why I say the possibility. Right. Because someone with a disorder of sexual development may have the external genitals of a female, but the internal genitals of a male. Mm-hmm. And so they may produce a lot of testosterone, but not sperm. And this does get rather complicated. Right. But the definition of male and female is not complicated. Right. And it is simple. And it boils down to someone's physical reality, and chromosomes in general, in over 99% of individuals, we are all either XY or XX. There are very rare conditions. 0.05% of the population has one of these rare conditions, which I just mentioned, intersex or DSD. Now, what the proponents of gender ideology do is they take these extremely rare conditions and they extrapolate from the fact that they exist. They want to say, well, sex is on a spectrum. I mean, look, we have these individuals that are what used to be called hermaphrodites, and they're not clearly male or female. That means that none of us are clearly male or female, that it's this huge spectrum of possibilities. And this is what kids are taught, that on one spectrum, one end of the spectrum are, Barbies, XX girls that are stereotypically, into makeup and dresses and all the stereotypical stuff. And then on the other end of the spectrum are stereotypical, that's the GI Joe, and he's into cars and trucks and playing football. But there's many, many places on that spectrum, and you have to find where you belong on that spectrum. Now, in a way, that is true, but that is regarding personality, Nick.
Right.
The spectrum is regarding personality.
Right.
And that's regarding, like I mentioned earlier, the mosaic, that all of us might have elements that are more traditionally male or female. But when it comes to physical sex and biology and reality, it is not a spectrum. Sex is not a spectrum. Now, what's gender? Gender is completely different than sex. Gender is how one feels and how one identifies. And it's been proposed that we all have something called a gender identity that is separate from our sex. And so a person may have a XY chromosomes and male genitalia, but he may feel like a woman or a girl. And gender ideology proponents would say that gender overrides biology. Gender overrides sex. And you see, that's where all this gets very complicated. We are using gender as a synonym for sex, and we should not be doing that. And we're at the point, in fact, that if someone, let's say, goes into the hospital, goes into an emergency room with abdominal pain, and they are asked, "What gender are you?" by the triage person, and this is a girl who identifies as a boy, and she says, "I'm a boy. My name is Jeffrey, and I'm a boy." She, on her medical chart in that emergency room, it is going to say that her gender is male. And it's going to put her preferred name and pronouns. And so a doctor may not realize that he or she is dealing with a female patient who might have a abdominal pain with an etiology, a reason that is unique to females, such as pregnancy, such as ectopic pregnancy, such as endometriosis, and any other number of conditions.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous thing. And so we're at the point now where even medical records might be identifying patients based on their gender identity instead of their sex. And there's no doubt going to be, and actually there already is a lawsuit of a woman who came in and presented as a man at the hospital and was given an abdominal x-ray. She was found to be pregnant afterwards. And that means exposure of the fetus to radiation, which is not good.
Interesting. Well, and herein lies one of the primary contradictions in the whole belief system. Basically, if a baby is born and certain people are saying things like, we are assigning this baby the male sex, right? Like the whole sex assigned at birth. I heard you address this when you were speaking to Congress, that, as you said then, sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is established at conception, and it is basically observed at birth or recognized at birth. We don't assign sex. And so I actually think that a lot of people who embrace this gender ideology acknowledge the distinction between sex and gender. And I do feel like it's kind of evolving in a way that you described, where now gender is kind of overriding sex. But many of them, that's part of the premise of their whole argument, is that my gender can deviate from my sex. But the contradiction then is, okay, if sex and genitalia doesn't determine gender, then how does changing those genitalia affirm gender? That's a contradiction.
Well, I guess what the answer to that would be given, just playing devil's advocate, is that people who have distress over their genitalia because it doesn't match their inner experience think that changing their genitalia to match their inner experience will help them.
Really?
But we don't have the long-term evidence that would support that. That's a whole other topic that since the publication of my book, there's been huge developments in this area that underscore how correct my argument is. The Cass report came out a few months ago. Very, very important. The Cass report came out of the United Kingdom. It's spelled C-A-S-S. Hilary Cass is a very prominent pediatrician in England, and she was asked to prepare a report on this issue of how do we best take care of these young people. And to make a long story short, Nick, she studied the topic for 4 years. She and a very excellent group of researchers at York University in England. And their conclusion was that the evidence for medical interventions on minors, not only medical interventions, but on socially transitioning minors, name, pronouns, allowing kids to use the opposite sex bathrooms, that the evidence is threadbare. It is astonishingly poor quality. And we should not, under any circumstances, be providing these medical and surgical interventions until we have more data. And as a result of her report, Britain has essentially banned puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. They never they never were doing surgery for under 18-year-olds, whereas in this country, we are definitely providing those surgeries, especially the mastectomies. And as a result of the Cass report, a number of other European countries have followed suit. And the only kids that are going to have access to these interventions, which have to be considered experimental at this point, are going to be kids who are accepted into studies, clinical studies, and they're going to be very strict criteria, and they're going to be followed very, very closely. Now, compare that with what's going on here in the U.S., where in some states, kids can walk in without the consent of their parents and have access to estrogen and testosterone, which is going to, these are medications that will permanently, within a few months, change the bodies of these kids permanently. A girl's voice will be forever lowered so that she'll sound like a boy by about 3 months of testosterone. That is irreversible. And I've talked to many young women who so regret doing that. And they've lost their singing voices. They will no longer be sopranos. They will, and many other changes in the body that we don't have the time to elaborate. Mm-hmm. So in this country, we are outliers in the way that we are rubber stamping these kids' new identities. And gender affirming care is now being challenged throughout the world, and specifically in countries that are known to be very progressive and very LGBT friendly, such as Sweden and Norway and Finland. So we're watching this edifice crumble slowly in this country. It is happening. I'm glad to see it happening. I agree with you that these individuals need to be treated with respect and compassion, but we cannot be going into kindergartens and, elementary schools and teaching these vulnerable kids that, as you mentioned a minute ago, sex is assigned at birth. Sometimes the adult in the delivery room makes a mistake. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong. And only you can say who you are. This is what kids are being taught. Vulnerable kids who are on the spectrum and don't like themselves and feel like they're outsiders and don't have friends. And they latch on to this idea that their bodies are wrong. Let me also add that, girls and boys who are on the spectrum, many of them have sensory issues, and they're uncomfortable with the changes in their bodies. And they don't like the idea that their bodies are going to be changing and they're going to get periods and they're going to, grow body hair and they're going to grow breasts. Many of them don't want to grow up. They're fearful of adulthood for many reasons, not only being looked at in a sexual manner by other people, but just adulthood in general. And they would like to remain childlike. So the idea of a puberty blocker is very seducing, very attractive to them.
You kind of, in your conclusion chapter, you, of course, as conclusions go, you kind of tie everything together really nicely. And what came into focus for me in that chapter was that I think maybe an accurate way to describe what's happening is that there's this collection of ideas now that form a whole ideology, a whole movement, a whole set of interventions that has become really an extremely destructive force that is portrayed as a movement based in kindness and accepting people. And you kind of lay it out nicely. I took a few notes that, we don't have time to talk about some of the historical figures that really shaped this, like John Money, but people can look up by reading your book or look up this figure, John Money. But he was essentially the first to kind of deny biology, as you put it. And then psychiatry's role was to kind of normalize a disorder, as you put it. In the DSM-3 and 4, it was gender identity disorder, and the disorder was based on basically identifying as the opposite sex. But now in the DSM-5, the disorder is only based on the distress that accompanies that,
Right.
not the
Right.
perception. So that's a fundamental difference. And so that their role was to kind of normalize the disorder. And then we have the Dutch protocol, kind of the first study, which you kind of pick apart, but that was where the puberty blocking came from, and that was kind of based on those adults that you described earlier that had a really hard time being passable as the opposite gender. So the idea was born to maybe block puberty in the first place. And I just want to highlight that you do a great job addressing the false claims about puberty blockers, the claims that they're perfectly safe, that all you're doing is pressing pause like a song on Spotify and just giving a person time to think about it. But as you point out, almost 100% of children who are put on puberty blockers are then also put on cross-sex hormones.
That's right.
Making it very difficult to know what the long-term effects of just using puberty blockers would even be. We have the role of educators, the public school system, essentially operating on this idea that we know best what's good for the child. Maybe we even know better than the parents know.
Yeah.
We have the role of lawyers, redefining what abuse is in the household and suggesting that if your parents don't affirm your new identity, that this is abusive, that your home is unsafe now, and Child Protective Services can get involved. And the stories that you shared regarding that are heartbreaking, gut-wrenching. And then we have, of course, surgeons coming in to, as you put it, you name it, we'll do it. We'll reconstruct your genitalia. We'll make it, try to make it look like a penis or a vagina. And I want to talk. Or neither. Right. That was fascinating. The eunuchs, that's mind-boggling. So this whole collection of ideas that, like I said, has become what I think is a very destructive force, and that it gets us so far from what I think the appropriate response would be, which is your body's not a mistake, and we can't try to align your body with your idea. We can't do it in that direction. We have to kind of do the reverse. And it's so, I think what is most affirming for a young person to hear is, again, you can be masculine if you're a female. You can be feminine if you're a male. Recently went to a cafe. This came to my mind when you were describing the GI Joe to Barbie spectrum. And this young man was in there working, and he was downright pretty, wearing a Barbie shirt, like very well done makeup, the most feminine appearance you could possibly have. And I was like, awesome. Like I love that this young man has been empowered to present himself in this way that's, very non-typical, but clearly authentic to him. And I just really hoped that was as far as it went, because I feel like, he was able to accomplish and be perceived perhaps in the way that he wanted to be perceived, which was as very feminine. And that was my perception of him.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Nick. This has really been great. And we didn't get a chance. I want your audience to be aware that aside from all the things that you mentioned that I cover in the book, I also give parents very practical advice on not only how to manage the situation if your own child is now has come to you with this announcement, but also tips on how to prevent that from happening, tips on how to reach your child before these dangerous ideas reach him or her. Because trust me, the internet and even the schools are filled with activists and people that want to reach your child and influence your child. So parents must understand that even, if their child is very, very young, there are ways, for example, you want to tell your child that, for example, if you have a boy, that you have always been a boy since the very first moment that you existed in this world. You were a boy and you will always be a boy. And that's just so wonderful. And there are many ways of being a boy. So you want to impress your child with that idea and bring it up when you can, because learning is an experience over time that requires repetition. And so when your child first hears this phrase, sex assigned at birth, he or she will recognize, no, that doesn't sound right. I wasn't randomly assigned, that I was a boy or girl when I was born. I've been a boy since the moment I was, in my mother's tummy, or however it is that you want to explain it to your child. So I want parents to reach their child with the truth before these ideas. Language is very powerful. Language shapes the way that we think. So this phrase, sex assigned at birth, over and over again, makes even adults believe that there was some, big event that occurred, some big decision in the delivery room. And that's simply false. It is not a decision that's made at that moment. It is, as you said, and I will say again, established at conception. So there's many other things in the book. I have a number of appendices that will guide parents on what to do about getting control of your child's use of the internet, how to find a therapist, an appropriate therapist, how to deal with schools, how to deal with child protective services if it comes to that, and many, many other things. Also, finally, the book is it's on audio. And I know a lot of people don't want to sit down and read a 300-page book, but they may want to listen to it while they're driving or doing the dishes. And so I did the narration of the book.
Nice.
And people are really loving it.
Oh, wow. Great. Well, again, the book is called Lost in Transnation, A Child Psychiatrist's Guide Out of the Madness. It's got the rigor of a dissertation. It's extremely, it provides great historical context, and it is indeed a guide. You're right, as you just emphasized. You really do a great job of offering concrete ways to respond.
And a foreword by Jordan Peterson, Dr.
Right.
Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you too. And thanks to the audience for listening to the whole conversation. Until next time.
Bye.